All right, then. I think we can start. I must admit that I don't remember whether in Slovakia one waits 15 minutes academic or 5. No one knows nowadays on Zoom, but nonetheless, let's get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for all of you who joined us for this session. And of course, thank you for the organizers for this Bratislava BAK Summer/Spring School that the organizers so generously put together despite or in spite of this COVID-19 pandemics. My name is Hlavajova. I'm artistic director of BAK, Basis for Actuele Kunst in Utrecht, which is a base, true to its name, a basis that brings together art, knowledge, and social action, if you will, a place where you think how things are in the world, trying to imagine how things could be otherwise, and try to see, can we, through with and in art, enact that possibility of another world. Of course, while working from within the conditions of the world, our guidance comes from the ideals or principles of social culture and ecological justice. Now, among many projects that we organize, we also have organized BAK Summer School regularly in Utrecht as part of the Utrecht University series of summer workshops. We've done so for many years, and while the summer school in Utrecht is special, BAK Bratislava Summer or Spring School has a very special place in my heart. Of course, it's a combination of the fact that it's happening in Bratislava, if one can claim this in these times of technological mediation. Bratislava, a city where I spend a huge part of my life, but also because this was initiated by one of our alumni of the very first BAK Summer School in Utrecht, Kristina Orsakova. And thank you, Kristina, for doing this and persevering despite the impossibility of being together in physical proximity. Of course, I would like to thank other partners in the project without whom this would not be possible, and that's namely Daniel Dida from Open Studio in Bratislava, David Koronci from Studio VVV and Department of Intermedia at Academy of Fine Arts and Design in Bratislava, then András Cefalvaj from Digital Arts Platform at Academy of Fine Arts and Design in Bratislava. And to be sure, also thanks to Juraj Midla, who's facilitating today's conversation. Now that I'm at it, the technicalities of this session, a couple of housekeeping notes. We're going to first engage in a conversation, Kader Attia and myself. Feel free to add questions using Q&A function. I am not quite sure whether this is possible, but you could try to raise your hand as well. See whether we can see you in this webinar constellation. So I'll keep the housekeeping notes there, except please know that this session is recorded. And there we go. Now on this 5th day of this edition of Bratislava BAK Summer Spring School, I feel extraordinarily privileged to be joined by Kader Attia. Thank you so much, Kader, for finding time and joining us. Now, Kader hardly requires an introduction, I think, but still I'm going to do so. Kader Attia is an artist who explores the wide-ranging effects of Western culture hegemony and colonization. Central to his inquiry are the concepts of injury and repair that we're going to discuss, which he uses to connect diverse bodies of knowledge, including architecture, music, psychoanalysis, medical science, and traditional healing and spiritual beliefs. Throughout his multimedia practice, ranging from sculpture to, let's say, film installation, reparation does not mark a return to an intact state, but instead makes visible the immaterial scars and psychic injury. This approach is informed by Kader's experience of growing up between Algeria and the Paris banlieues. Of course, Attia's work has been shown in biennials such as the Shanghai Biennial, Gwangju Biennial, Manifesta in Palermo, Venice Biennial, Venice, and Documenta in Kassel. Many notable exhibitions. Please just allow me to name a few. The Museum of Emotion at the Hayward Gallery in London, 2019. Scars remind us that our past is real in Fundació Juan Miró in Barcelona in 2018. Roots also growing concrete at McVal 2018. Repairing the Invisible at SMAC in Ghent, etc., etc., etc. It's important, I think, to also mention that in 2016, Kader founded La Colonie in Paris's Gare du Nord area as an open space for decolonial thinking, debate, and culture activism, and we'll be touching on that practice. And Kader, many of you may know, has also been appointed as a curator for the 12th Berlin Biennale in 2022. Thank you again, Kader, for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Fragments of Repair is how we name this conversation, but it's also the name of a multi-part project convened by BAK with Kader and the Colonial Forum La Colonie in Paris. It is nearly 2 weeks ago that we inaugurated the project, precisely on the 17th of April this year, albeit I have to add that the physical venue of BAK is closed, so the exhibition at this moment is not accessible. Now, besides the exhibition at BAK, which we're going to discuss in detail, the project consists of 2 other main fragments. What's in the title, Fragments of Repair. And that's a collective study program at La Colonie in Paris, named Fragments of Repair La Colonie Nomade. And then the third part is of an online series of gatherings with lectures, conversations, screenings, and assembly forums that is taking place every 2 weeks in the course of the project. To be complete in this respect, I want to say that the project has been conceptualized by Kader Attia and my colleague at BAK Witske Maas together, and in conversation with Françoise Verger and the BAK team. Now, the project Fragments of Repair shares many urgencies with this year's Bratislava BAK Summer Spring School titled Art During Death, as they both are shaped within and in spite of the present-day pandemic conditions, and thus necessarily addressing the notions of death, dying, bereavement, as well as wound, injury, and repair. Now, allow me to, in this respect, read a brief introductory text to the exhibition so as to offer a humble framework from which I would like to begin. I hope you bear with me a few more minutes of this introduction. Now, taking place 1.5 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, the project Fragments of Repair emerges into a world in a more visible state of brokenness, an avid multiplier of not just itself, but every injustice it encounters. The virus and its effects continue to reveal deep-seated wounds and injuries across the globe in need of repair. Brought into full view, it becomes obvious that these wounds and injuries issue from the nexuses of historical colonialisms and present-day authoritarianisms, economic disparities and growing racial violence, and the continuous abuses inflicted upon already vulnerable, precarious lives and increasingly frequent climate disasters. These underlying historical, social, political, and economic conditions really amplified under pandemic emergency by social isolation, sustained stress, chronic uncertainty, existential insecurity, emotional despair, exhaustion, loss, and fear. These have expanded this viral contagion into a disquieting global psychological pandemonium. This is the urgency that shaped this project, even if, or perhaps in spite of the fact that we cannot gather in physical proximity, so as to engage in an ongoing collective, multi-directional and propositional conversation around the following question: what pathways can repair, not as a return to past ways, but then trajectory shaped by demands for decolonization and the politics of restitutions, And thus, what pathways can repair offer to life in and out of the viral and psychological pandemonium? Driven by this question and the urgency of the wounded psyche and the injured collective mental health, the project puts forth the notion of decolonial repair, conceptualized by artist Kader Attia as both a tool and a tactic of engagement with the current conjuncture. Now, injury, wound, and repair, to be sure, have been key concepts across Kader's artistic practice, particularly in relation to the material and immaterial injustices of colonial violence that persist into the present. Repair, according to the artist, is, and I quote, a form of cultural resistance by means of reappropriation, unquote. And Kader, and we will have chance to discuss in this in detail, but Kader often cites the Japanese art of ceramics mending, kintsugi, or the practices in pre-colonial African societies, while kintsugi showed broken ceramic pottery fragments resealed in radiant gold to highlight both their breakage and repair. The latter, the pre-colonial African societies, engage in boundless chain of reparation upon reparation upon reparation, acknowledging the object's journeys and making the traces of their memory fully evident. In this view, we will understand repair is always necessarily bound to wound and injury in a fundamental and permanent way, even if the mind, especially in the societies faring under the modern flag of reason, even if this mind wants to have its psychological and physical scars removed, erased, or hidden at the very least. Against such denial, Kader proposes to reclaim the scars, keep them inside, and thus acknowledge that in every repair, there is something irreparable. In other words, that every repair is necessarily partial, fragmented, and fragmentary, hence fragments of repair. Now, this fragmentation, this irreparability, if you will, then is both the reservoir for ways of knowing the world, as well as a source for future-oriented resistance and resilience. Repair, then, is not a return to what was, or what we hear oft-repeated desire of return to normality, if we bring it to today's pandemic reality, but a space for collective performative imagination aimed at carving alternative ways toward what is yet to be. So I keep it here for now, and I would like to propose that as Kader and I cannot join you in Bratislava this time, we thought to take you, even if symbolically and via digital means only, to BAK with us to visit the exhibition, work by work, to discuss these matters, and visit, of course, the role of art, artwork, artists, art institution, vis-a-vis the urgencies that make our world what it is. And how, there was a question in mind, how can this be thought, imagined, and enacted otherwise? Can we think through pathways to another world, if you will? I'm going to see whether this is going to allow me to share my screen with you, and I think it should have allowed me. And I must admit to everybody that Kader has not seen the exhibition in person. And I would like to, and that there are so many open questions about this artworks exhibit there. It's a remarkable exhibition. But there are so many questions I wanted to ask and never could, because we didn't have a moment to drink a cup of coffee, and maybe this could be an invitation to such an informal conversation, really, about all works in the exhibition. So this is actually the entrance to the physical side of BAK, to our building, our exhibition space, and I'm just going to enter. When you really quite literally physically enter the building, this is the view that unfolds in front of you, actually having in view a number of artworks already in this project that are gesturing towards this notion of repair. And perhaps Kader, we can start from these beams. It's untitled, as you can see, it's a series of sculptures, but there is something really important happening there. And maybe we can start from here, and I just offer you to take it away.
I think it's thank you, Maria, for this introduction, and hello to everyone who are listening here. I think it's interesting to start the exhibition with old wooden beams that have been repaired in a very, I would say, rough way with these staples. You were speaking before about how much these different forms of repair that exist in pre-modern societies, such as the kintsugi in Japan and other repaired in Africa, for instance, repaired of calabashes. Calabashes are these bowls or mask or any wooden art. I would start by I think giving you a very, very important thing to understand how much the repair is a stake that any human being is facing. Could it be physically, formally, or of course, we'll see later, also psychologically, and even, I mean, intellectually. I think that the repair is basically what moved the existence. It's an agency. Things cannot stay stable because life is movement. Many philosophers have been talking about this, from Asia to Europe. I'm thinking about Bergson, or even before René Descartes. Consciousness, it's a movement. It's not stable. I think that when we look at an object repair, could it be from the kintsugi or these beams repaired? It's extremely important to have both at the same time in the frame, the injury and the repair. Maybe it's a movement looping itself. And I think, by the way, that the repair is inseparable from the injury. It's a big mistake to think that repair means that the injury has been erased. This is really, really the modern rational certainty of what means repair. Repair comes from repair, I don't know how do you say in your language, but in German, Reparaturen, in French, réparer, in Spanish, reparación, in English, repair. The roots, the etymological roots of repair come from the Latin word reparare, which means to return at the original state. And the whole agenda of Western modernity that I've started to observe, particularly at the beginning of the 20th century with the injured body of the World War I, is that sciences can control the injury, because repairing means to erase the injury and bring the object, the broken object or the body, at the, not at its original state, it's impossible, but at the idea of its original state. And this is also a lie, because the injury is always somewhere. We don't see it. I know a couple of people here in Berlin, like a fantastic woman, Anna Goebel. She's a restaurateur of ceramics. She's able to repair any ceramic pots, jar, anything. You cannot see with your eyes the cracks, the fault, but there is a fault. So it's very important to understand that for me, this is a crucial point to polarize two ways of thinking, the non-Western pre-modern one and the modern rational Western one. Because on the contrary, in pre-modern non-Western societies, even in the West, it's not only Africa or everywhere, in the Middle East, in Europe, it was like this. Repairing meant to keep the injury visible. The ethic of the repair was moved by a sort of sincerity in which showing the injury of the object, the accident, was, I don't want to speculate, I would not say that it was a statement, but I think that they didn't care about showing the injury. Just to give you an idea, a couple of years ago, many years ago, I was in Istanbul. They have this monument underground called the Cisterns. Mm-hmm. So it's a pond, a huge pond with columns. I think they have it since the Roman, I think, since it was like Constantinople. One of the columns is held by a head, I think of Medusa or of a figure from the Greek or Romanian mythology. It has always been here. And I'm really, really convinced that this is a reaper. Because you have the columns like this, and you have a head at the bottom that is holding the columns. So if you want, this question of repair, keeping the injury visible, is definitely what possibly was supposed to be repair originally. The idea that we have to make that when a car, an object, a body is repaired, the scars have to disappear. It's a modern fantasy of denial of the injury. And here we go into politics, because what does it mean, this movement I was speaking about? The movement is time. When we show the injury of an object and its repair, we actually show time. We show, we like in a music, in phenomenology, the first analysis by Edmund Husserl about perception of time was using melody, music. I think when you show an object repair, you really embodied in the same object 2 times, the accident and the repair. And then you create a movement by staying in the same place. And that's why, for me, showing these columns of wood that has been naturally, because of the time, dried, and then have revealed significant cracks, repairing them with this staple, like we used to do in the past in Africa, but again, also in the West. I found this kind of repair in 18th century beams, rooftops, for instance. It's funny because even we were mentioning La Colonie before, but we did some renovation at the beginning, and there was a beam repaired with these staples, with 2 of them. So let's call, even if I'm very skeptical about this terminology, traditional repairs, the way to, I mean, the sign of a moment where the injury was part of the life, and we were not denying the time. Yeah, I mean time basically. And if you translate this to the body, the society we live today, which is obsessed by staying young, removing the wrinkle, the whole plastic surgery that is about, yeah, I mean, really running after time. Mm-hmm. It's part of this narrative. So to finish with, and I'm sorry if I have been long, but I think it's important to understand that many artists are repairing. I think we are all repairing. But the difference is that I do think that when artists are able to understand inside the reaper what language can emerge from, then it becomes another story. And I think all these kintsugi and Japanese and anonymous repair you could imagine that you can observe in museum, in culture, in history, are languages. The person who have repaired it says something.
Kader, I wanna touch on that notion of time. And I recall during the opening, when we had a similar setup of a conversation, you suggested that perhaps you could see a role of art or artwork to slow time. How to think this statement in relation to what you just discussed about movement and showing time?
Yeah. Well, I think First, we have to understand that we are definitely living in a society that not only celebrate the speed. This is the case since the beginning of the 20th century, but it's also a society where we have now understood that any technology, from the simple hammer to algorithm, have been invented by human minds to accelerate. The numbers, math is a machine. So my concern with this is that in time of pandemic, this acceleration has been enhanced because we do not take any more the time to, I mean, just do what we used to do, for instance, to learn. Of course, today we are sharing a nice moment, and I can also speak about this because I think it's part of what I do believe, has in reference to philosopher like Gilbert Simondon, he used to call this individuation. But I think what we are doing right now is that we are slowing time a little bit. So most of the time, if we talk about technology, this algorithmic governance in which we are living now is about this acceleration. It's about it's constantly hijacking what used to be in between the subject and the object. It's almost impulsive, what we see in social media, etc. We are living in an impulsive economy. I mean, data mining, the algorithmic governance, which basically reused all the traces we leave by using the technology. We are trust, we know that. We have, each one of us here has an algorithmic double, a virtual one. Aim at accelerating accelerating the correlation of all this information to define statistically our fantasy, our desire, our profile to be more interested by these books and not this one, etc., etc., this food. I think that if there is one, I would say, I mean, possible form of resistance against this algorithmic governance. Again, don't get me wrong, I'm not against technology at all. I love technology. I'm just thinking that we are using it the wrong way. We can speak about this later. It's by thinking about how much artworks can, on the contrary, slow time, can be a machine to slow time. Because the relation you have with an artwork, any creation, from poetry to theater piece, to painting, to installation, to any creation that started by a dream, even a daylight dream, and then become a thinking, a concept. And from the concept, then you have to, of course, realize it, produce it. All these steps, for me, are paradoxically are like creating, yeah, taking care of the present for the viewer relation. When any viewers is I mean, yeah, is interacting with an artworks, this interaction happens in a present moment. But I was also saying this because I think, like many sociologists, like Dominique Boulier, for instance, who works on mediology, the science of media, that we also live in a world where the young generation, so you might be concerned by this or interested, he's I mean, he's the receptor of endless everyday information without having, if I may to use a technical word, sorry, the hermeneutic to interpret them. And all informations. Jacques Derrida used to say that, of course, when we did invent systems of writing, the person who would send a letter to someone else knew how to write and then how to read. If you write a letter to someone, the person who will be able to read it has to be able also to write. So if you write a letter, you know how to read a letter. It makes sense. If we think about images, it's not the case. Massively, the mankind is completely analphabet of images. We are living in not only in an algorithmic governance, but in an ocean, in an endless flux of images that we have not been educated to interpret them, to have an hermeneutic power on it. I mean, a capacity of interpret them. And that's why I do think that what we need to relearn is to learn. We need to relearn to learn, because and because of this speed, because of this endless acceleration of messages. Could there be images? Could there be anything that we have not we have not been educated? Even me, I mean, I'm still learning every day. So art and artwork is the only, I mean, at large, even the music, capacity or field or entity produced by a human mind that really like slow this acceleration and involve the viewer into a sort of learning interaction with the creation.
This is fascinating, Kader. I never thought to think text and image in the same way, the way you present it right now. I know we still have the whole exhibition to go to, but I still want to pause by one thing, because you talk about speed and slowing down time. But of course, we are in the exhibition and the notion of decolonial repair that is trying to connect various epistemologies, right? So it's to a great extent, it's looking at how to circumnavigate around the notion of Western modernity. I want to ask in relation to time, whether it's only speed that artworks have to do with, or does this do something also with orientation of time? Because we know Western modern linear time goes from past through present into the future. Does it do the slowing down? Is it only about speed, or is it also something that impacts the direction or a possibility of another futurity, if you will, in the time that is telling us continuously there is no other future but the one prescribed from colonialism through neoliberal capitalism into more of the same?
I mean, it's if you want, it's a metaphysic question. Of course, we have all different conception of futurity, you know. But I like in your question one word, the notion of orientation, because I think that the possibility of reorienting time is also a form of, I mean, is inherent, so linked to hermeneutic capacity. If you are able to interpret images, if you are able to interpret, let's say on images, because we are in an art conversation. If you're able to interpret images, you might be able to reorient it. And one of the difficulty today, I would say, is that like Annie Lebrun says, an interesting French philosopher, images are not anymore visible. What makes an image today, it's not its visibility. Why? Because the economy of images has also been impacted by the dematerialization of the economy. Today, images exist also in a flux of distribution. When someone is taking a selfie or a photograph of something that he or she share, they have abolished the in-betweenness that used to exist between the production and the distribution. This is massive. my friend artist Jean-Jacques Lebel did a whole piece on that from the torture of the Abu Ghraib jail in beginning of 2000. Remember the scandal of these American soldiers who were raping and abusing and on Iraqi prisoner, and they did share the image on Facebook
instantly
to say, look, to their friends, how much we have fun here. So what is interesting in this work by Jean-Jacques, he actually increased these images. They are very pixelized, etc., but they are disgusting because they are torture images. Now, when you see that, you show them in exhibition museum, you have all this sort of, Western hypocrisy that say, oh, these images should be shown, so we cannot show this in the exhibition. He had many difficulties to show them. But when I read Annie Lebrun today, Jean-Jacques did this in 2002 or 3, or right after 9/11. I think, I mean, this is really like this, what the Abu Ghraib scandal is really the first moment in history where we see the torture perpetrated by an army as an entertainment. Even when we saw torture, they were like stolen images. Of course, images of torture have never circulated. And I'm very interested by this because I think that today, the abolishment of the space of distribution that used to be, on the one hand, managed by different biopolitics, the censor, Ministry of Censorships, the media, the truck companies who used to ship the magazine, etc. This industry and economy that has completely disappeared makes that for all of us, we are confronted with a relation with image, any of the image that we watch, that without really seeing them. The reason that we see an image, the reason that an image becomes famous, belongs to the number of clicks on it, on the internet, to the number of likes. And here we go into what is a society of the number. So how, as artists, we can exist in this? This is very important. I mean, for me, the society of the number, and I don't know if you know, but in French, we call digital numérique, number, because anything, even our interaction, are numbers now.
But you mean actually computational capitalism?
Computational capitalist. Computational capitalism, of course, which is based on calculation, is an extremely dense environment in which artists and artworks need to understand what kind of strategy could be possible to just continue this fantastic adventure that is art.
So you address the incalculable against the computational in capitalism?
Maybe not the uncalculable, because I don't think it's possible, but I would say the slow motion.
There you go.
I would say the slow motion, because in the slow motion of the artworks, in the slow motion of, I mean, to care, I mean, the slow motion for me, it's a form of repair. It's a care. It's caring about time. It's caring about duration. We do not learn without duration. You need to sit at the side of, like Françoise told me once, you sit at the side of an old woman weaving. You have to be curious a little bit and watch her moving. I don't know, I know the French term is la navette. You know, in Morocco, you have a lot of weavings of carpets. I mean, the notion of duration to learn for me is extremely important. Of course, I'm still learning until today differently, but this economy of contribution that we have built is the opposite of this notion of this care of the duration. I prefer to use care, because care also means repair.
Wonderful. Shall we move to next work, which probably is a kind of heart of the exhibition? You can see it behind the beams, and that's the work Reasons Oxymoron from 2015. And this is where you kind of brought together various culture practices and perspectives regarding subjectivity, the psyche, and the imagination around the world. It's 18-channel video installation. It's here a little detail with captions so that everybody can see. And here you're developing culture specificities of the concept of repair under various titles, whether reason and politics, the magical sciences, religion, modernity, capitalism, and schizophrenia, etc., etc. You brought together people ranging from various fields, ranging from psychiatry to ethnography, storytelling, shamanism, philosophy, history, music, etc. And it's a really extraordinarily fascinating film. Speaking of slowing down film installation, I wanted to say, speaking about slowing time, this really requires almost slow viewing in order to be able to absorb this multitude of various perspectives. Speaking of slowing time, I think something we could discuss here is the idea of deep listening, or maybe even let's try to look at this through the notion of decolonial listening. This is what Rolando Vasquez discussed throughout their writing quite a lot, decolonial listening as a mode of creating relation within and with the world that allows you or prompts you, better said, to listen to those who have been silenced by history, if you will. And of course, this goes hand in hand with decolonial thinking, which Rolando Vasquez talks about as thinking with others. Yeah, and so this decolonial thinking and listening seek to form kind of relational worlds that go beyond the hegemonic framework of Western modernity. Of course, claiming that there is no modernity without coloniality, and there's no coloniality without modernity. So I wonder whether you could take it away, from this notion of deep listening, or maybe even decolonial listening, and to what extent this notion of listening, and maybe even deep hearing, I don't know what this is a term that one uses within these practices, to which extent that shaped your thinking when working on this particular work.
I mean, of course, you have different ways to understand and address the question of repair. As I say before, it's very much linked to the injury as far as I'm concerned, and also to the self, to the subject. So it can be very individual. But at the same time, I would say that one of the, really crucial importance of this notion of repair is that you can really find it and in so many, field of researchers, fields from politics to science to art to, and what I have discovered the most, as long as I was deepening my researches, is that probably one of the significant aspects of the repair in politics, which means, like Catherine Malabou says in the debate, trauma, because what means an injury of politics? It's a collective trauma. Of course, in the collective trauma, you have individual traumas, but generated by a political context, it's a trauma. So if we need to address the question of repair politically, for me, collectively and individually, we need to understand how much it is important to listen And listening is the beginning of the repair. And that's why I went very close to psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, because again, I find, I mean, starting from my own history, in one person of my family, when she was young, has been healed by a traditional healer, and the neighbors have, and I mean, in France, never understood how this could happen, because they had a son with the same illness, and they had to bring him at the hospital. He was epileptic, to make you understand the thing. And my mother decided to bring my sister in Algeria to visit a grand aunt who was a witch, and she healed her really during a year in the mountains. You know, she came back in France. She was 11, and she never gets sick again. So I started to be very interested by I mean, what was at stake here, you know, whether it was magical or rational or whatever. And then initially I started this work on Horizons Oxymoron by asking to a neurologist who is in the film. His name is Olivier Galaverna. What does it sound for him? How does he interpret this, you know? And then from this, I, of course, discovered that they were sort of interlacing between Western modernity and pre-modern societies in terms of mental health that were pretty much political, and not only absolutely not outside a political agenda, I would say, in the sense that while the family who were friends of my father, communist, they said, no, you should not send your sister in Algeria. I mean, this is epilepsy. We have good hospital here. She will be healed with medicines. And until now, the son who was healed by medicine is in a psychiatric hospital until now, because it was in the 70s and the medicine were very strong. For me, this helped me for years to just wonder, understand why it did work first, and how come that I mean, culturally, some population could be more confident into the rational, you know, modern project in terms of science, in terms of healing, and other who would definitely trust the legacy of the ancestors. And I found, I have to admit, through the readings of Frantz Fanon, the relation between alienation and colonialism, a very, very narrow, I mean, path and dense and strong to understand this. So I decided to set up in this installation within different interviews of psychiatrists, philosophers, thinkers, historians, filmmakers from Europe, from Africa, the question of mental illness and how it has to, I mean, and what does it mean in the light of topics such as modernity, schizophrenia, capitalism, not necessarily like anchored into mental illness also. And I think the conversation that comes out of this give us an interesting elaboration of how colonialism is not only like simply this very rough idea of occupying a land or people or bodies, or it's much more, it is much more complex. And I would say the legacy of this clash that has happened, of course, when a white psychiatrist arrived in Africa, and in North Africa and in South Africa, there have been, I mean, today you don't know this, but the literature of colonial psychiatry is just unbelievable. I mean, the descriptions of North African and Sub-Saharan African by the British, the French, the German was, I mean, I read some of them. It's just unbelievable. So
Frantz Fanon himself, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
And his political psychiatry, right? This is what he engages, kind of on one hand showing the entanglements of psychiatry, mental illness, and coloniality, of course, but also suggestion that mental illness will not be cured by a pill. It can only be cured by adjusting or changing political and social circumstances. So therefore, this entanglement of mental health and larger social political conditions is really crucial to understand, also from today's perspective of COVID-19, which causes such a huge psychological pandemonium. But I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I agree, and thank you, Maria, for precising this, because it helps me also to go to one important argument that I found when I was doing my researches, is that most of the time, and also interesting, not only in Africa, everywhere, even in Germany, even here in Berlin, in the psychiatric hospital, when you work in this field with a project that makes you the listener, talking about listening, you really start to wonder who is mad? Are the mad the real mad, or are we mad, us? And I think here we go into this complexity that Fanon, of course, has underlined, that what makes the trauma, the mentally ill person, is the social environment. And then because we are mentally ill socially and not biologically, like many also even psychiatrists says, we need to understand how much we are fragile, and particularly today in this pandemic moment. I mean, mental health is something that each government should care. I'm like stunned since ever that they are not government with Ministry of the Care of Mental Health, because we are living in a society of psychological anxiety constantly. So it's like, oh, they are the very mad who are insanely visible. And then for those who are not visible, everything is fine. I'm sorry, there are a lot of mad people in the society. And that's why I'm interested as an artist to work on this, because I think, to finish with, that art is not only a slowing down machine, it's also an interesting therapeutical strategy. I'm not talking about art therapy. I'm not pretending that I'm going to heal people with my art. I don't want to do that. But what I found interesting is that any artworks, hijack your attention for a moment in which you are not anymore yourself. And I think this is important, to leave yourself. Just a few moments.
Fascinating. There's a one citation that I want to bring up from this work that Witzke, my colleague at BAK, pointed to me, and that's by Algerian filmmaker Malek Ben Smail, when he talks about how his father's practice in emergency psychiatry was first and foremost a practice of humanist listening. And here comes the quote: listening to what society does not want to hear. And then it's in a similar vein, then Ben Smail's role as filmmaker has been to film what society does not want to see. Mm-hmm. And perhaps this work also plays towards that to a great extent. Mm-hmm. And hugely importantly, it does not privilege one epistemologic system over another, right? It does not dismiss the knowledges, the epistemology of Western modernity, but it does not privilege it either. And I think that's what's extraordinarily interesting on this particular piece. But before we move forward, and we should, just this, first I was really taken aback by how it is installed. I thought this is a bit counterintuitive to install this, hugely multi-vocal, multi-talented work, to enclose it quite literally in these office cubicles. and of course invented in the height of Western modernity as a place of equality, where, you know, and autonomy and what have you. Essentially, this is a control mechanism of control, surveillance, oppression. I don't even know what other words I should use here. Could you just few seconds? I mean, what motivated you to install this piece in this office environment?
I mean, for me, maybe the missing word you were looking for is the panopticon.
There you go. Thank you.
Because I think the cubicle are really incarnating what used to be this jail, you know, from where one guard from one point, one cell could watch all the prisoners. I think it was in England, but Foucault spoke about it. And I think cubicles, offices are panopticons. So they pretend to preserve the intimacy of the users, but in the end, they are transforming the users as a product of the neoliberal capitalism. And it's interesting that I did this work, in 5 years ago, but in the end, when we wonder about not only the social distance that needs to be kept now because of the pandemic, but also, again, just the fact that we are like the lockdown imposed us to stay away, you know, from each other in so-called intimate psychological intellectual spaces. I really wanted to create a mise en abîme of the subject and the complexity of how to exist in these oceans of stories, of narratives, etc., subjectively. And on the other hand, how to how to imagine how to imagine a possible emancipation out of this by staying individual. And here we're back into this notion of individuation I was talking about. How to be together by staying ourselves. How to be, you know, and it's, for me, what is interesting also technically is that there are 18 films in the project with different durations. Some of them are 11 minutes, some other are more than 30 minutes. But I really wanted that you don't need to see all of them. I think it works like a library. And if you watch 3 films, which exactly, you get the project, and even if the 3 films are different. And this is what exactly I received as feedbacks by many, many, many people who saw it for the first time, like they saw 3 films because they didn't have time to follow all the film. And then they came back at the University of Dartmouth College in the US, in Lyon, everywhere where I showed it, the intimacy that the setup gives you to sit in front of a screen and having one person in front of you, like this, for instance, is the great psychiatrist Momar Gueye from Dakar, Senegal, who was the first psychiatrist who opened the door of the schizophrenic department of his hospital to traditional healers in 1972. This was a revolution, really, in psychiatry. I think it's interesting to really also think when you address an artwork about the audience and how you want to connect with them. I don't trust this work that do not care about the audience. This is a sort of it's not even not generous. It's a nonsense. Antonin Artaud used to say, when a book is, he has a book in a manuscript in his desk, and he said, when a book is not published, it doesn't exist. So there is a moment, Antonin Artaud, it's a very nice example talking about also psychiatry. I think there is a moment where listening means being able to listen. And then, of course, releasing such a, I think the whole installation is about 5 hours, 35 minutes. If you want to follow them all, go ahead, no problem. Some people did, I know that. But if you just want to pick some films, I think it's interesting also because Yeah, it's not only about slowing time. It's definitely about slowing time to learn and to learn how to learn. And I have learned so much in this project for many things I didn't know, that I really try to, and I cut the whole film. We could say it's a long film of 5 hours 35 minutes in different screens, so that the audience can really like get into it.
Thank you for bringing the notion of learning, because I do see these works as repositories of knowledges from which to learn how to deal with current trauma, injury, or from which to learn the strategies of repair. And in the context of another project at BAK, together with Janne van Heijswijk, we were developing this concept of an artwork as a learning object, an object to learn from. And indeed, there's many hours of video material in the exhibition, but while we are closed due to obligation of social distancing, we now invited a couple of people, researchers, artists, to come for one day, one person residency at BAK. So they have, 8 to 10 hours at their disposal to really sit through the works. And this idea of slow viewing and slow learning proves to be extraordinarily important and really cherished by many. But I'm going to move us further, and I'm going to see what I can cluster 4 works together. These are 2 works, separate works. This is a show which shows their quite interesting correspondence. I don't think these 2 works were installed together this way, but on your left side, you have a work, Oil and Sugar, from 2007. And here a crude oil is poured over this white cube, let's say, made of sugar cubes, so that it collapses. Although it, of course, as in the loop, it returns back in its original state. And of course, the work speaks to the place of oil and sugar in the colonial architecture of the global world, historically and at present. And of course, we could go in depth and discuss, how this recalls both plantation and sugar slavery and petroleum and extractivist machinery of capitalism today. But this idea of architecture, whether symbolically as colonial architecture of the world or architecture as such, which to some extent is the entry point into this work, La Tour Robespierre's the Robespierre Tower, which is a drone recorded portrait of this vertical living kind of machine at the suburbs of Paris. Nonetheless, it's again your very particular fascination with architecture and modern architecture and the linkages and genealogies around or in between or among various modernities, if you will. I'd like to see whether we could touch on this work, because of course Oil and Sugar is from 2007. This is 2018, so it's pre-COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. But I think through the lens of COVID-19 pandemic, this gains new meanings in a really a robust way. And I would like to touch on this. But I'll add this particular work called Snails from 2009. There's also playing with the modernist architecture grid and the toughness and robustness and minimalism at the same time of this building in the background, and this severed plinth that is also carrying some sort of a grid, but kind of organic grid of snails that are in collectivity, huddling together to survive the drought and heat. And then this particular work, following the modern genealogy, which is a series of collages where you precisely look at the linkages and connections and genealogies between Western modernity and other modernities, and the mutual or maybe one-way borrowing. I'm not quite sure what your position towards that would be. This is a brief detail into one of the collages, and this is an aerial view from above to the, let's say, archival background information or knowledge archive, if you will, with images and publications. So maybe we can select one of these works that you would want to talk about around this question: where does this fascination of architecture really come from, and how does this play to this narrative of repair?
I mean, initially, I've been interested by the legacy of, in general. I mean, I've been interested by history, and I have to say that in terms of colonialism legacy, one of my interests a couple of years ago was how much it has always been clear for the Western psyche, or I don't know, epistemology, that African non-modern art has influenced strongly modern artists, Western modern artists, such as Picasso, Braque, etc. But I was quite surprised to discover, particularly because it has to do with a city I know and a country which is mine, that the architecture from Algeria, which has strongly influenced the Western white modernism of Le Corbusier, for instance, has never been acknowledged as such. On the contrary, there's a kind of invisibility of the lack of inspiration that these architects have found in what they do call, with a certain contempt, I would say, vernacular architecture. So I decided to work on this. It was around 2006-07. I decided to really think how art can readdress this legacy. Just to clarify, I have to say that one of the most important things is that even if you can be a bit hungry, it doesn't make sense to be sort of vindictive in your statement. For me, it's very important also to acknowledge that we are also artists. I mean, and artists are influenced by other influence. So I found even more exciting to work that way, because it's more complex. You just have to deal with much more data, and you have to really I don't know, the funambulist, someone walking on the string. I think this is the task of the artist, who is a repair artist. So I found different mediums interesting. The use of organic foods, like couscous. I did a work of the city of Gardaya in couscous. I use the sugar, I use mint, I use bread, I use organic ephemeral materials. Sometimes I use them in the exhibition. Some other I represented them, like here with the whole and sugar video, which indeed it's a cube of sugar, of pieces of sugar, on top of which I have poured oil, black oil, and I just wait. And I don't know if you saw the video, Maria. It's Granny, and actually it's Granny because it used to be. It's not even digital. This is DV camera, and I remember I was filming it, and it's also in terms of what is an image in the end. Today when I was talking before about the distribution, the absence of the distribution today, and the fact that our relation with image has to do very much also with the number of clicks or likes or whatsoever. I think that it's also interesting to understand that we are also a generation that have been using different kind of techniques of images, and an image that can exist even though the technique through times means that it's an image that can constantly rebirth by itself. And here the video start with this white cube. I said the video also, I think it's extremely important that you understand that if this work and also the Tour Robespierre work are both video, then they are motion works, they are in movement. If we can release later online an excerpt so that you can have an idea of the object, it would make sense, because now we have photographs and they are not photographs. So, and again, remember what I was saying about consciousness. Consciousness is time, it's movement. even when we don't move. Like Henri Bergson used to say that even a consciousness which is not moving, it's moving because it's moving through time.
Yeah.
I think what is important with the white cube of the oil and sugar is that you have this sort of initial critique of the legacy of modernism that I'm doing through my works. It's a very early work, and you have one of the most significant symbol of modernism in architecture is the white cube. Not the white cube as we thinking in art.
In our world, yeah.
But from the outside, you know, the white building, the white cube
the
building.
Minimalist, great, functional.
Yeah, exactly. And then after I poured it, it started to really like drink this oil, becoming black, referring also sometimes there's a moment in this movement where you could imagine the black Kaaba, the most holy symbol of Muslim culture. And then suddenly it collapsed, and it collapses into a sort of mix of oil and sugar, in which, of course, I mean, the result of it is opening you, I would say, your mind of this sort of pharmacology of modernity. That on the one hand, the pharmacon is the poison and the remedy. On the one hand, at the same time. On the one hand, it's not because I'm criticizing modernity that I really want to get trapped into the sort of very naive, primitive critiques. There are good things in modernity. I'm aware of that, but it's a poison too. And the best example of it is it's the Promethean promise of modernity. When Promethean has stolen the fire from the gods to give it to the humans, he has given them a remedy and a poison too. So oil and sugar, let's say, opens these cycles of works dealing with modernity as a legacy from which we did not, or we are still working on it. We are still dealing on it. Because modernity is so much linked to the biggest injuries of the 20th century. What we most of the time call modernity in architecture, for instance, is both colonialism, and it is also fascism. Fascist architecture from the Nazi here in Berlin or from the Italian by architect, like decolonizing architecture. Alessandro was telling me this. I found this extremely interesting, particularly because it is an architect, an Italian.
Alessandro Petti.
Yeah, he told me, but modern architecture is fascist, and fascist architecture is modern. And I think we need to understand this better, that there is a sort of narrative that separate fascism and modernity in architecture, which does not make sense. And what he was saying, basically, I saw it through colonial architecture that has been spread in Libya by Italian and Ethiopia, but also by the French and the British. But again, it's an interesting debate if you go to Algeria, because on the one hand, there has been a dispossession of the local legacy of architecture from the city of Gardaya. So what did happen precisely? In 1930, Le Corbusier was visiting Algeria. He had to give a lecture at the Department of Architecture in Algiers. He gave 2 lectures during 2 days, and suddenly he disappeared. Everyone were looking for him. Where is Monsieur Le Corbusier? He disappeared. Le Corbusier went to the Kasbah of Algiers. He spent 1 week. And from the Kasbah, he went to Gardaya. So what is Gardaya? Gardaya is a city located not in the middle, but almost of the Sahara Desert, in a valley, which is a miracle because we speak about a valley with oases in the middle of the Sahara, in which a population called Ibadit, actually Mozabit, but their religion is Ibadism, arrived in the 11th century because they were persecuted by the Sunnite. So Sunnism has persecuted them heavily. They were the first chiasm, schism in Islam. So they have been massively killed, and the few of them who could escape have escaped in the desert of Sahara. They are also in Oman today. All Oman countries Ibadit, and a little bit on the island of Bizerte in Tunisia. What interested us here is how Gardaia then became after they arrived. The Ibadit, the Mozabit are, and Ibadism also, it's a version of Islam that is, we could compare this a little bit with the Protestant. They are Swiss Protestant. They are very much workers people. They are very much devoted to the inside of the home, the family. So the architecture is very much elaborated inside, and from outside it looks very rough. It's like almost martial. And they have an incredible sense of the community, of the share. So when Le Corbusier arrived in this location, he was mesmerized by what he saw, because he was watching an architecture of the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 19th century, which was basically aesthetically and technically, in terms of urban planning, a new architecture. The roof, the flat roof, for someone who was coming from Switzerland, La Chaux-de-Fonds, on the region of the Jura, where the rooftop are like this. He was like fascinated by the fact that a rooftop could be an extra room in the house. There were many things that he picked for other statements. And actually, what is extremely important is that until the 1994 in France, the Foundation Le Corbusier in Paris, there were the denial of this influence was, I mean, never disputed, ever, until one architect from Lausanne, Alexander Gerber, who did his PhD in 1994, clearly wrote a book called Le Corbusier, The Orient Trip, The Orient Journey. And he says, I mean, the Chapelle de Ronchamp, Notre-Dame du Haut, this is a quotation of the Sidi Ibrahim Mosque in Gardaia. And then he really clearly illustrate that Le Corbusier has been taking not only aesthetic, but precise detail from non-Western architecture in Turkey, in the Mediterranean Sea, in Gardaia, reuse them into its own statement. So for me, it's important also to combine these conversations that we have today, because we are together, with anonymous listener, the visitor, the viewers. So that's why I like in my work to not only use the medium of the video or collages, but also to really show or give references to the viewers, so that for the people who are interested, the conversation can continue. Mm-hmm. Because here again, it's about how to learn and how we need to learn how to learn.
Thank you, Kader. I am keeping an eye on time and on Q&A function of this Zoom. Unfortunately, we don't have any questions directly. Okay. But there are two more works I wanted to go to, and we will not manage in time. So I just wanted to ask whether we're going to look at the body's legacies in the remaining 6 minutes, or rather in this news work, the objects interlacing. And to guide our decision which work we discuss, I want to remind ourselves that today, the 5th day of the school, is guided by the notion of acceptance. Mm-hmm. Of course, the school is divided according to 5 stages of grief, borrowed from Swiss American psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. These 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I would like to see the relationship between repair and acceptance, if we could do this in 1 minute in a way. But it might be that this particular work really could help us in thinking this through. And just a brief introduction. Of course, it's the installation with video and 17 objects that are either, all of these are replicas made either in wood or 3D nylon or 3D print. These are 3D prints of African artifacts. And in the video, the discussion is around the notion of restitution. Restitution, of course, of stolen artifacts through the machine, a colonial plundering machine, of course. And the conversation is not as straightforward as suggesting just return the objects where they come from. So the notion of restitution is, of course, very complex in recognizing and accepting, perhaps, that the journey is much more complex than just, you know, withdrawing from one context to another. Of course, the objects, perhaps to an extent, absorb certain identities and positions that was given to them as ethnographic objects in Western museums, etc., etc. Simplifying very complex subjects, I'm aware, because we pushing through time. But also these replicas are as if witnessing this discourse on restitution, this complex discourse of restitution, and they throw their own shadow over this discourse, which is quite fascinating, because to me it feels almost like a more than human assembly, where conversation happens not just through text, and then that is only possible through deep listening, but something more is happening there in the interlacing, in the interaction between the spoken word, recorded images, and this shadow play that's happening here.
I have to be honest. It's a work on restitution which needs a lot of time, you know, to be explained.
Unpacked, yeah.
But I like the way you described it, Maya. I think for me, it's important to understand that, maybe for you, just to understand that I've been working on the question of restitution of artifacts stolen during colonial time in Africa since the 1994, when I was in Congo. And then I started beginning of 2000 to really investigate the presence of all artifacts taken during colonialism in the Western world, in Museum of Ethnography. And when the question of restitution became so-called hot in contemporary art and in field of anthropology, because of the speech of President Macron in Ouagadougou 3 years ago, I think, I was already, I mean, for a long time working on this question, and for me, and still I am, what I was saying before about how much listening is important in repair, in a repair project, as a repair significant strategy. I think I really decided to do a film that would give the voice to those who have been, I would say, on both sides of the question. So the anthropologists and prints, like the Prince Gizo, or thinkers, writers from Africa, and also more or less the same kind of profile on the other side, from the Western white world. And I think I have discovered that in the end of the day, the question of the object is not absolutely not taken care by the political and official discourse, is the affective, is the affect, is the emotional relation we do have with object. So basically, it's before and beyond this cultural legacy. It is linked to it, of course. It is, I would say, it's even through it that we can understand the complex relation we do have with object. I'm asking, for instance, in the film, to a psychiatrist what is an object for her, and she said, she's French, and she says that, I mean, she told me off camera that she has grown up in the north of France in a family where people used to hate her, and in camera she says that because she lost her mother when she was 5, she had to be introduced by her aunts, always like she's the one who lost her mother. And she said that, I mean, psychoanalytically, it's very heavy. So, okay, you understand that she went through a very difficult time. But now she said, for instance, that she used to lose object, keys, credit card, anything.
Everything.
And then she became like super, with a lot of anguish, you know. And she said, today I don't care. I lose them. And I said, oh, again. And she said, you know, I never heard my mother speaking to me, because when she passed away, I was too young and there were not like systems of recording the voice. If there is one thing I miss the most is to hear a voice. And I discovered a couple of years ago that I developed for the last 15 years. So many workshops with my patients at the psychiatric cells that she's working in Aubervilliers. So many workshops of singing. And that all the songs were songs about the mother, famous songs, as Navour. And I think this is extremely touching, because I really think that there is a form of alienation that also capitalism has been playing a lot on, by owning an object. I think we become bigger when we are able to disalienate ourselves, this owning notion. And maybe this is the one decolonial strategy.
This is maybe a good bridge. We have two questions, Kader, and I would like to bring them both because they're crucially important. One comes from Witzke, and it brings us in the full circle from the beginning when we talk about motion and movement to emotion. And Witzke says, the idea of art bringing one outside of oneself also reminds me of what philosopher Bashir Diagne talks about in this installation, Objects Interlacing, on emotion, or rather emotion. Emotion being outside of motion. Could you talk about this? Because this idea of reclaiming emotion is very important in your work, even though emotion is being disputed as unreasonable, as your member had said during the opening debate 2 weeks ago, when we talk about the turn to visceral politics. But in your work, Kader, emotions are profoundly important as an epistemic source of repair. Could you talk a bit about this? And I will stress a bit about this.
No, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Achille is a philosopher or politologist. I'm an artist. And I really think, like, I would say Bashir Diagne took this explanation from Senghor, who was also a poet. I think emotion is, we need to remember that the word emotion comes from the French, was pronounced the first time in the 15th century in France, in Old French, esmotion. And esmotion comes from esmovere in Latin, which means moving. The French did use it to actually qualify riots by crowds in the east of France who used to, riots because of people starving. And I think what we have to understand in this notion of movement from the in to the outside is something that for us, for you, if you are art students, challenge the notion of visibility. So in the film, Bashir really brought that Senghor used to say that the mimic art is, the quote is, the reason is Hellenic and the emotion is African. So the mimesis of Greek art, Hellenic art, which reproduce the world, the bodies as they are in the mankind, and the contrary in African old arts, really define two ways of dealing with emotion. On the one hand, being touched by what you see, and on the other hand, being moved by what you see. Because what you see is not referring to, again, the reality that you are surrounded by. So it's I think it's interesting, not only in the notion of I'm still working on how to deal with this sort of rationality and emotion on one hand. What I found much more interesting, and you're right to underline it, Witzke and Maria, is this notion of movement. Of having yourself moving outside the body.
Excellent, thank you. I have last question from David Koronci. Thank you, David. David announces this as a rather simple question. It's a very complex question. What are the methods of choosing artistic strategies and forms to create a platform, a space in the notion of the art object as a slowing machine? Your work is multimedial in its core, so I'm interested how you navigate between different media material decisions.
I mean, it's an interesting question for an artist, because all artists, and I'm sure maybe many of us will understand this, are attracted by experimentation. And because when you are thinking about an issue, you also, as I said before, you learn. So I like to be new in a medium, so I like to experiment new mediums. I think the notion of art by definition does not mean one medium. For those who prefer to be the expert of a medium, of their medium, I can understand. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm a very curious person. I've always been interested by this notion of externalization that we call technology. Is for me what really is a sort of prosthetics to engage with a field that you don't know. So each time I have to say that I'm like investigating something, I'm not looking for at any price for a new medium as like a new prosthetics, but I leave this sort of medium imposing itself in other media, actually, as a media, because the medium, like Marshall McLuhan used to say, the medium is the message. I think it's not on the work. This quote doesn't work only in digital media. I think also, I really think also that artworks are prosthetics too. And then formally, to neglect the form in your artworks, it's I think would be a mistake. I think you really have to be as much as possible caring about theory, for sure, emotion, but also about form. I don't think that we can like separate these prosthetics, and that's why for me the question is not only about mediums formally, I would say, even it's also about whether a work can be discursive, or on the contrary, like Ole and Sugar, it's just like 4 minutes, it's a gesture, or La Tour Robespierre, it's a gesture. So I like also to go back and forth between very discursive works and also very simple ones. Sorry if
Excellent.
I didn't.
Thank you so very much, Kader.
Welcome.
Gosh, I miss these conversations. We would, in between installing the exhibition, we would have these conversations. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity, for your time. And really thank you again, everybody who's been invisible to us, but present nonetheless, the presence that is felt certainly and hugely appreciated. Thank you so very much, everyone. Thank you, Kader.
Thank you very much. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.